So, within our own personal relationships, we often find that, what brings us happiness conflicts with what brings someone else happiness, whether it's a coworker, whether it's your spouse, whether it's your kids. And it often leaves us at times struggling, with how do we proceed? It feels like one of us is constantly having to lose out and sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of someone else's happiness. So how would you recommend that we proceed in life and in our social endeavors and in fostering these relationships that you speak of, that we need to focus on building if our happiness doesn't exactly jive with what someone else's happiness is?
So what the research would tell us is that the decision that you make actually isn't important. Whatever you do, whatever the choices you make, whatever the conclusion is, doesn't matter. What matters is how you reach that decision. What's important in terms of predicting happiness and relationship satisfaction and longevity is actually how do you manage and navigate those differences so that both people feel heard and understood and valued. And that process of working through conflict and disagreements is actually the single best predictor of divorce.
So you're saying essentially that don't worry so much about the end result. What's going to bring you happiness isn't so much the end result as much as it is going to be the path that you take to get there, whatever it may be.
Exactly.
Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Philosopher Society podcast. Today, we have a very special guest for you all. She is a professor of psychology at Amherst College, keynote speaker, and author of The Positive Shift and Why We Act, among several other amazing psychological works based on a number of different aspects of psychology and specifically the psychology of happiness and what can help you to recover a sense of joy in your life if you happen to be struggling with that. I first found Dr. Catherin Sanderson while listening to her Intro to Psychology lectures on the Great Courses. So I would highly recommend you check those out. I mean, I listen to those routinely when I'm trying to create content for my page or whenever I just need some additional perspective on life to help me in my personal endeavors. So I definitely recommend that you check that out. It was also noted there that she is one of the top 500 educators in the nation right now. I'm a Philosopher Society, and I definitely recommend you check out her Instagram, Sanderson Speaking. Dr. Catherin Sanderson, I thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with us here today. And welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I am good. And I so appreciated the invitation to talk, and I have been looking forward to this. So this is frankly a welcome change from my day of grading and meetings and office hours and teaching because we just get to talk. So thanks for the invite.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I must admit, when I first started this podcast, the idea of having Dr. Catherin Sanderson on the show was a huge goal of mine. It was a huge goal of mine. I mean, I definitely wanted to make sure that I put my best foot forward with previous episodes and everything, to make you feel comfortable, accepting this invitation. So I can't tell you how much of an honor it is to be able to speak with you. I really do appreciate it.
Well, as I often say, more psychology in the world is good for us all. So thank you for all of your endeavors on social media and your podcast through getting more information about psychology out there.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, for me, it was really a personal journey that started with, I have to say it started with massive weight loss for me, I mean, after you lose that kind of weight, it's like you're left with this kind of brain chemistry that keeps you in this routine where it makes it really difficult to find balance. It's like you're never quite happy with what you see in the mirror. You're always reflecting back on the way that you were. And it really took, much philosophy and psychology for me to actually find some kind of balance in life, And I'm so thankful for that journey because, man, I've learned so much and it's brought me to your lectures and your books as well. And I can't tell you how much they've been a help to me, and I know a help to many people out there.
Well, one of the challenges I think for many of us, who are academic researchers is there's this feeling sometimes that you're toiling away, writing articles, writing textbooks, et cetera, and doing research, but no one's really benefiting. And so what I love to do, and what you clearly love to do, is to take the research findings from empirical, nerdy scientific studies in psychology and to share them very broadly. Because really the point is that people should benefit from the findings, that they should be able to use them to stick with weight loss, to build happier relationships, to change how they interact with their children, to spend more time in nature, to improve their physical health, their psychological well-being, their relationships, and so on. So any opportunity that I think we have to share the really key takeaways from empirical research, I frankly think is really important.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I forget which ancient philosopher was that had said, the whole point of philosophy is to better ourselves, and any philosophy that doesn't help us to improve our situation in life is useless to us. So, let's see. I've got a list of questions here for you that we're going to get into. That I'm definitely looking forward to hearing your answers. So, first question. What was it that made you want to become a psychologist? I mean, I've heard time and time again that the life of a psychologist can be very difficult. I mean, you deal with people's personal struggles and oftentimes horrific traumas that people have gone through. I mean, it almost seems like forgive me for lack of a better way to say it, but I mean, it almost almost like a type of mental martyrdom to sacrifice sometimes your own well-being for the sake of others. What compelled you to want to take on this course in life?
Yeah, so that's such an important question, and it's the kind of question that I frankly talk about with my college students all the time. So when I went to college, I had never taken a course in psychology. I didn't really know what psychology was. But I fell in love with psychology from my very first course, which sort of ironically was delivered by Dr. Phil Zimbardo, who is sort of most best known or worst known or whatever for the Stanford prison experiment. But what I loved about the field of psychology then was the sort of practical implications that you really could use it. So I decided I would like to be a clinical psychologist. I would really like to, see patients. I would like to be a therapist. I would like to help people. And I started doing various different kinds of volunteer work, including volunteering on a campus crisis hotline for people who are really struggling. And that experience was really profound for me, in part because I realized that I was not actually well suited for that I found it very hard to speak to people who were really in the throes of severe mental challenges and to go home and sort of be happy. I was very bad at sort of work-life balance, and I couldn't sort of shut it off. And that really led me to sort of think about, okay, when I'm thinking about a life and crafting a career, I need to also have a career that's going to allow me to be a mom and to, have hobbies and activities and to be happy more broadly. And that led me to thinking more about doing the research side of psychology. So I am not a licensed clinical psychologist. I do lots of research that touches on issues that have really key practical importance for mental health and relationship satisfaction and disordered eating and lots of different clinically relevant things. But what I found that I really loved was doing the research, sort of coming up with a question, figuring out how to answer that question. And then hopefully the findings of that research would be useful to people who were struggling in particular ways, even though I'm not going to be the person who's doing the therapy work with clients.
I see. I understand. That's an interesting answer because I mean, normally we think psychology, and you think there's one profession in psychology that you can actually be, and that's a psychologist dealing with people's problems. But what you're saying here is essentially that there's so many different aspects to psychology, and there's many different ways that you can be part of the the mechanism in society that has frankly helped a lot of people. I mean, where would we be without people like you? I mean, how many people would still be suffering on the streets? And I mean, it's maybe the most important work that that anyone could take on in society is to develop this this life of wanting to help people. I mean, I remember when I was young, I mean, I had inspirations of possibly becoming a psychologist, and oh man, I could remember my parents even telling me, Jesse, are you sure that's something you really want to do? I mean, what are you going to say when you're sitting there across from someone, that's, been, molested as a child or suffered some kind of abuse, I mean, that's a really hard life, but oh man, the idea that, there are definitely more ways to help that person, I mean, writing books, becoming an author. So I know that what you've gravitated towards is the subfield of positive psychology. So if you can tell us for a moment, what exactly is positive psychology, and what led you to want to develop positive psychology as a field of study?
Really important question. So I am old enough that when I went to college, and even when I went to graduate school, the field of psychology was very focused on the negative stuff. So the field of psychology focused historically on how do we treat problems, depression, bipolar disorder, phobias, anxiety, neuroses. And there was really a strong focus on how do we fix things that are problematic. And about 20 years ago, there was a movement that was started by a really famous psychologist, Martin Seligman, who said, we really need to be focusing on psychology as power and potential and growth and positive functioning and well-being. And he actually convened a group of leading researchers, largely in social psychology, but not entirely in social psychology, to say, let's try to understand more about what leads people to thrive, as opposed to what leads people to develop problems and how do we treat, repair, fix, et cetera, medicate different kinds of problems. So that field actually developed after I had finished my training. Like literally it's that new in terms of the field. But I heard about it. I was aware of it again for being a person in the field who went to conferences and read journal articles and so on. And my research has focused historically on health psychology, so issues of physical health, and also on relationships. Those are sort of two areas that are my specialty. And what the field of positive psychology really revealed as empirical research started happening is that the link between happiness, health, and close relationships is actually all intertwined. So I found this field just fascinating because it was really a way of combining the interest that I had and the work that I was doing in terms of looking at physical well-being, psychological well-being, and relationship satisfaction. So it just really appealed to me intuitively. And I frankly think it appeals to lots of people because we all, in some sense, would like to be happier and healthier and have good relationships.
And that is a phenomenal, universally profound way to approach psychology. I got to admit, I'm guilty of it. I mean, I'm a big fan of psychology and studying psychology, and I'll download a number of different audiobooks at night while I'm working to try to develop my psychological knowledge. And oh man, I got to say, for some reason, I mean, I just tend to gravitate towards, or at least right now, it's like I tend to gravitate towards, the science of cult leaders and the science of psychopaths and, what causes someone to, harm people and that kind of thing. It's almost like we have an innate inclination towards dark aspects of psychology, so for someone to actually step forward and say, no, wait a minute, let's flip the coin here and look at it in terms of what we can do in a positive way. How can we study people that have actually succeeded in life? What's their psychological disposition, and what can we learn from them to help others? That's a fascinating approach to psychology. I've been listening to a number of different books too on history, and it's pointed out from a historical perspective, we study wars and leaders and empires, but what we really don't tend to study is the happiness of these civilizations, how happiness has evolved and progressed throughout society, throughout the evolution of culture. Uh, why do you think that is? Why do you think that we're so automatically willing to listen to the serial killer podcast instead instead of actually looking for practical uses for our knowledge base? I mean, that can actually help improve our lives.
Right. So it's such an interesting question. So there's actually some research, and I'm about to teach on this in the next week or two in my Intro to Psychology class here at Amherst. There's actually some research suggesting that at an evolutionary level, we need to really be hardwired to monitor threats in our environment, because threats historically have killed people. So people who were not worried about snakes or fire or heights or whatever actually died off. And people who had that fear of snakes, of fire, of heights lived and passed on their genes. So on
Wow.
some level, we are hardwired to say things that are threatening, I got to really pay attention to. And so I believe that this is sort of a precursor. Historically, it's just a remnant evolutionarily, is that things that are scary, serial killers, threats, etc., we have to really be mindful of those things because those things posed a risk to us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, because oftentimes I'm working night shift at an industrial plant, and it's a skeleton crew there. There's only like a handful of us, you know. And oh man, the other day I got to tell you, I had seen one of my coworkers, and I didn't know he was a coworker. You know, he had on a uniform. It's a funny story, and he had on a backpack and shoes, which is uncommon. You know, normally we're all wearing steel-toe work boots, and he had on tennis shoes, and it's the middle of the night. You know, the guy wants to be comfortable walking around, but I seen him, and I called the supervisor right away, and I'm like, hey man, we've got an intruder on the plant side. He's wearing a uniform, but I think he stole this uniform, you know. And so all of a sudden he comes out of the office, and I'm like, oh my God, Peter, what are you gonna do? What are you doing with tennis shoes on? I was this close to you, running you down with a truck, you know. I mean, I couldn't believe it, you know. And so it makes sense because you're saying this, and it's like I'm finding that I'm gravitating towards wanting to listen to serial killer kind of podcasts. And I'm at night, you know, it's not exactly a safe area. I mean, Oakland, you know, is one of the crime capitals of the United States. And oh man, I mean, it really is about my brain getting in this mindset of monitoring for threats. I mean, that's really kind of why I do it, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. Well, no, and that again, that makes sense, right? Because you need to be hardwired at that level. And so again, if you were hardwired for, let's look for things that are funny or pleasant or nice or friendly, that's not going to help you live, right?
Yeah, I mean, because I didn't have that kind of inclination to listen to that type of stuff when I was on day shift. I'll tell you that. And so now it's like I walk around at night and I'm all super
That's so
jumpy.
interesting.
You know,
Yeah.
if I listen to these things. So, I mean, that's essentially why when you turn on the news, it's mostly bad news, isn't it?
Right. I mean, there's that famous expression about news, which is if it bleeds, it leads. Do you know that expression? So the if it
I've heard
bleeds, it
that.
leads
Yeah.
expression is specifically because the idea is that that's what gets people to stick on that channel and to not, turn away. So, right. I mean, that it makes sense in lots of different dimensions.
So now what we're going to move on to is we're going to talk about happiness, since most of your page seems to be centered around how we find happiness in life, and that seems to be, uh, the deeper ends of your psychological work is to help people find happiness. So, I mean, Aristotle more or less says that happiness is the end all be all in life. It's the end to all means. It's the reason why we do everything in life. We don't strive for happiness to achieve some other end. It's always us striving to achieve happiness is the end goal. So what exactly is happiness? What is it that we're essentially chasing here?
So that is not a simple question, in part because people really disagree on that. There are some people who believe that we should think about happiness as sort of overall broad life satisfaction, contentment. If I could live my life over again, I would do it about how I have done. And there are other people who believe it really should be focused on momentary positive emotion, joy, excitement, exhilaration, and so on. So there's two different schools of thought in terms of how we really assess happiness. But overall, the sort of shared understanding seems to be that happiness consists of three components. One is pleasure. So I describe this as like the pleasure of having a great piece of cheesecake or listening to a beautiful piece of music. Then there is engagement, and this could be spending time with family and friends. This could be having a job that you find really rewarding. This could be anticipating a vacation you're about to go on. Again, kind of engagement in your life actively. And then the third component is really meaning. So doing things that you find meaningful. And this could be with volunteer work. It could be with your job, could be in your community, and so on. But those three things are sort of how I think about it. Are you having a life full of pleasure, engagement, and meaning?
Wow. Wow. So, do you think that that's a product of different schools of thought tackling the problem? I mean, you essentially have a psychologist answer, a biological answer, being that it's pleasure, and then you've got kind of a philosophical answer. I mean, is that essentially why we kind of have, it's a trifold thing, happiness?
Oh, I love that example of sort of paring it down in those different dimensions. Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Yeah, I like that.
What avenue do you feel is going to be most important for people to try to develop? I mean, should we go after, should we try to increase happiness by fostering, those momentary moments of pleasure, or should we focus on long-term term goals that are going to help us see our life as a whole as happiness down the road? Which avenue do you think is the best to try to take?
So I often make the point that happiness is not one size fits all. And I think that's a really important thing for your listeners to understand, because I think too often people kind of feel peer pressured into, well, meditation makes you happy, so you should meditate. And the reality is meditation can really make some people happy. And there are other people who find it really annoying, or not helpful. And so I recommend that people really sort of think about themselves and not pay attention to maybe what works well for their spouse or their sister or their friend, or their neighbor or something. So what we know in general is that many people find happiness in exercising. But again, that could be playing tennis or jogging or taking a Pilates class. We know that many people find happiness in giving, but that could be volunteering. It could be donating blood. It could be making charitable contributions. We know that many people find happiness from spending time in nature. And we know that almost everyone finds happiness in building good relationships with family members, with friends, with colleagues, with neighbors, and so on. So what I always advise people is to think about times in your life in which you have felt the best. And some people might say, well, that was, when I was running and having this runner's high, or that was when I was volunteering in a neighborhood center, or that was when I was spending time with my best friend and just catching up, or that's when I was jumping out of an airplane, or, whatever it is, that individuals find really different experiences most conducive to happiness, and paying attention to that and sort of gaining that self-awareness, I think, is a really important first step.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, I guess when it really comes down to it, it's more a matter of the individual, on an individual level. I mean, essentially, what brings happiness to one person may not bring happiness to another person. I mean, another person may be searching for meaning at the end of their life, while some person, may find happiness is about the little things, right?
Well, the sort of expression of, stop and smell the roses, right? I mean, that's an example, right? That really it is very, very individual in terms of what makes people happy.
The Buddha insight on happiness is that the pursuit of happiness in many ways it could be another form of suffering. We're always searching for it, believing that it exists independent of our own selves based on some sort of magical configuration of the environment that equals happiness for us. And when we do find it, we're always trying to hold on to it, out of fear of losing it. And then you have someone like Tolstoy, who I believe it was, who essentially says, if you want to be happy, be. And Tennessee Williams, who, in another variation says, luck is believing that you're lucky. So, I mean, is it possible to find happiness in your environment, or is it just is it really something that we essentially have to practice just being?
Right. So I think a lot of it is that happiness is really in the journey of it. And so being comfortable being makes a lot of sense. I think sometimes people focus too much on what's going to make me what's going to make me happy. And that actually kind of disrupts the ability of experiencing flow. So I teach a class in sports psychology, and one of the key findings is that athletes, elite athletes, but also less elite athletes, do their best performance. They perform the best when they're in a state of flow. And that state of flow is sort of when they're in the zone and they're not actually thinking, they're just being. And if you think about, I need to get into flow, I need to get into flow, I need to get into flow, it actually disrupts your performance.
I see what you're saying. So, I mean, with happiness, I mean, it really isn't necessarily something that we should be constantly looking for, something that it's more of noticing what makes you happy along the journey, along the path. I mean, more about taking stock about what you have. I mean, and looking at it in terms of gratitude for the journey itself, and not so much trying to find the avenue that's going to equal happiness. Essentially, is what you're saying.
That's exactly right. And I think that's, in fact, extraordinarily important to sort of be thinking about in terms of experiencing that journey and being self-aware and being present in the moment.
And on the sports psychology, I've got a question here for you. It's almost a little off topic. I mean, I've shared with you before, that I've got a boy that plays competitive soccer, and he plays goalie. And I mean, what more psychological position to play than goalie? He's 11. I got to say, this has been one of the more difficult seasons that I've seen him have to endure. I mean, they're a month into the season and they're already on their third coach, and so that's demoralizing for a team, Yeah, their third coach, already in this early season, and not to mention too, it's like, I mean, he's they're kind of having to play up a bit, I mean, the system that he's in right now, there's just not as many kids compared to other cities around us, so they tend to have to play up in terms of competition level. And, before, I mean, he would tell me, at the end of games, I mean, I've seen him go out there and take some really tough games on the chin, and he's just really unshaken by it. It doesn't really seem to bother him. He's really ready to come back the next game. And man, this season, I got to tell you, it's at 11 going on 12 next month. It's the first time that I've actually noticed he's experiencing, a type of, he's becoming disheartened with the situation on his team. After a last game, the real hard loss, he said that he was concerned that they're not going to win a single game this season, and I've never seen him be so disheartened after a soccer game, and my theory behind all of this is that, at his age, his body's developing and he's just more capable of creating new and different emotions that he didn't have before, like sadness and like despondency. I mean, is that true at his age, at 11? Is that when they really start to discover these negative emotions because their body and their hormones are just developing? Is that what I'm seeing here?
Yeah, that's absolutely what you're seeing. And I think it's also an age at which there is a lot of focus on peers. There's a lot of focus on comparisons. And when you are on a sports team, there is a lot of comparison of, who is better, who is faster, who does the coach, or in this case, coaches, like more. And so there can also be that sort of comparison which can be hard. I give the quote often, and this is actually the chapter title for one of my books. One of the chapter titles is "Comparison is the Thief of Joy." So a challenge within athletics is there's also a lot of comparison, and that can make it harder to sort of focus on yourself and the sort of intrinsic motivation and love of the game and so on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense with what I'm seeing with him as a whole. I mean, he's really he's really developing aspects of his own self-perception and his own self-awareness that frankly he didn't have before. And, I mean, in terms of happiness, I mean, when we're trying to raise children that are going to be able to find happiness easy in life, I mean, because it's true. Some people, I mean, they can be happy playing in mud, and some people need lavish type of lifestyle in order to achieve happiness. And as a father, as a parent, I mean, you want your kids to grow up to be one of those types of people that's not going to really struggle so much to be happy in life. And from this age right now, I mean, I'm guessing that this is a real tricky time for his development, where essentially, whether or not he's going to be a happy person later on in life is going to be more or less determined, by what happens to him during this stage of his development. I mean, so as a parent, I mean, what would you recommend we do with children at this age, that are starting to develop their self-perception? How can we help them to be happier people later on in life?
Well, first of all, that's a lovely question, and it's obvious that you and your wife are really focused on creating happiness for your son, and that's just lovely. So I will say two things. One, children probably come into the world hardwired in some kind of a genetic way that makes happiness easier or less easy for them to find. So I have 3 kids, and I can pretty much point to the kid who tends to be happier no matter what, the kid who tends not to be happier no matter what. And so we do need to acknowledge that probably genetics plays some kind of a role in terms of making it easier or harder. And that genetic link may also have to do with resilience. So how do people respond when things don't go well? And some people seem to be able to kind of pick themselves up and move on, and some people get a little bit more stuck. But the other key thing, and this is something that is really important because we control it, is that the things that make adults happy also make children happy. So the things we've talked about before: giving, spending time in nature, building good relationships, exercising. And children learn from watching their parents. So being able to watch you and say, oh, my dad, is always going for a run, or my mom is always volunteering, or these other things that make them happy is really important, because they're picking up on cues that you and your wife are putting out there in terms of your own focus on finding happiness. It's sort of like the example of, you're not going to raise children who read if they never see you reading. And similarly, if your children don't see you focusing on, hey, happiness is important, and so I'm going to go for this run, and I'm going to volunteer, and I'm going to try to spend time with friends, and I'm going to do these things that feel good to me, then it's harder for them to sort of adopt those habits that are important in their own lives.
That makes sense. So so fostering a happy environment for him to develop in really does later on down the road help him to be a happier person in life. I mean, it really does. It really does work that way, right?
It really does. I mean, it really, really does. Yeah.
So I'm going to focus on being more of a cheerful person myself. I mean, I think I tend to be generally pretty cheerful in life. I mean, at work, they all see me as this pretty cheery guy, but oh man, I'll tell you, there's definitely areas of that where I could work on it. And hopefully if he sees me working on it, he'll develop that willingness to work on himself too as well. Thank you for that. That's a really big help as a parent. So I can understand why pleasure evolved and why pain evolved, and essentially to discourage and promote certain types of behaviors. But Why do you think we evolved happiness? You would think from an evolutionary perspective, I mean, emotions like anxiety and fear and discontent, monitoring for threats within our environment, causing us to better our circumstances. These, they seem evolutionarily beneficial for obvious reasons, but happiness, what's the evolutionary benefit behind happiness to us?
So in terms of your question, why have we evolutionarily evolved for happiness? It's a really important question. Part of it might be that we like to spend time with people who are happy. So happiness is contagious. And this is why when you spend time with somebody who's in a good mood or who's cheerful, who's optimistic, it actually brings you up. It actually lifts you up in that way. And so in that sense, it might be that people who are happy had other people who gravitated towards them. Maybe they got more help. Maybe other people, supported them or provided social support during times of need in that way. Because happiness does seem to be adaptive in terms of people feeling good. And that may pay off in a variety of different ways in terms of giving people the ability to withstand grief or suffering, that people who have that resilience probably are better able to buffer the ups and downs of daily life that people tend to experience. So in that sense, it may be that people who have that ability to ride out difficult experiences are in fact advantaged in terms of finding their network, finding social support. The sort of famous expression of "it takes a village" might be particularly true, and that people who are happy often have other people gravitate towards them, and that probably having that extra support and companionship is probably helpful at an evolutionary level.
That is it. That is a knock it out of the park kind of answer. That is an amazing answer. So we tend to think of happiness as in how it benefits us, in terms of feelings and sensation, but at the same time, I mean, what you're saying is essentially is that it's more social. Happiness, seeing someone who's happy is a social indicator to us that they are that they live within a type of environment that is conducive to success. And so we're compelled towards happy people because they show us that they are essentially living in a successful environment, and that by extension causes us to seek out successful environments, which helps us thrive and survive as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's exactly right.
Wow. So that's why happiness, in many ways, your level of happiness is determined by the type of relationships that you have, right? Because it's a social a social evolutionary benefit so much, not so much a biological one in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
I love that answer. I really do. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. So let's see here. Another question for you. I've heard theory that suggests that happiness, at a biological level, is essentially like like an air conditioning system. People tend to hover around, say, your average person, say, hovers around 70 degrees. They're capable of reaching, say, 90 degrees of happiness and capable of dropping as low as 50 degrees, but that they tend to stabilize at around 70. Some people, their thermostat, the higher level they can go is about 70. The lowest they can go is about 30. They tend to stabilize somewhere around 50, and they're generally going to be less happy people. So essentially, this is why, they say money doesn't bring happiness. I mean, money can temporarily give you that boost up to 90, but essentially you're going to trickle back down to your level of around 70%, regardless what befalls you. I mean, if you find you have diabetes all of a sudden, your level of happiness is going to drop, but essentially it's going to rise back up, once that air conditioning system inside, kind of finds its equilibrium and balances you out. So, I mean, is there any way that we can, I mean, first of all, do you believe that that is true? Is that essentially how happiness works at a biological level? And if so, are we able to adjust that? I mean, can we, if you're set at a 70, is there some way that you can adjust that to become an 80? Or if you're a 30, adjust that so that you could essentially become a 50 and stay there and actually maintain that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a really important question, a really practically important question, frankly. And what I believe is that people have your example of the thermostat, the air conditioning unit. I believe that people have a sort of predetermined, probably a function and part of their genes, probably a function and part of their early life experiences, sort of happiness, set level, baseline level. And that it's hard to sort of move the permanent sort of happiness threshold, or to stay at an 80 or stay at a 90 unless you're naturally that way. However, I also believe that you can do things intentionally and deliberately to increase your own happiness. And I'm making that distinction because I think that that's not the same as just saying, now I'm at a 90, now I'm here. But what it means to say is, if I want to be at a 90 and I'm sort of naturally at a 70, here are these things that I need to do to bring myself up here. So I'm going to give a personal example, which is I have a family history, a pretty clear genetic family history of mental disorders. So I have lost a grandfather to suicide. I've lost a cousin to suicide. I've had family members who have lifelong struggles with depression, with bipolar disorder, with substance abuse, all of which are linked. And so it's pretty clear that I come naturally to this sort of level of not super happy. And I'm very aware of that. I'm very, painfully aware of that. And therefore, I am very, very intentional about doing things that increase my happiness. And that includes exercising. I really hate jogging. I really hate jogging. And yet I jog because what I really like is having jogged. And so I don't actually like the act of jogging. I'm never the person who's like runner's high, but I like the act of having jogged. I am very intentional about doing things in my life that make me feel good. So I know that you follow my Instagram, and there's a lot of posting on Instagram about dogs. And beginning in January of 23, I started fostering dogs, and I'm actually getting my 10th dog tomorrow is arriving tomorrow evening. Really excited about Nutmeg. And these are dogs that are taken out of kill shelters in the South, who are brought up, and I keep or two, and then they go to their forever family. Not super rewarding. There's a lot of pee, but it's super rewarding. I am very intentional about spending time with family and friends. That I make plans. I host dinner parties. I buy plane tickets, and I do all these things because I know that it's really important for me to keep doing these things, because I'm not a person who finds it easily and naturally finds happiness easily and naturally. So that means that I'm not at a 90 like spontaneously, but I'm at a 90 because I work to be at a 90. Does that make sense?
I see what you're saying. And oh man, I gotta tell you, I would never guess that you struggle with happiness. I mean, you don't seem like that at all. I mean, you don't come off that way at all. I mean, one of the things that I really love about your reels and your content, it's the nuts and bolts of the content aside is your mannerisms. You have really great camera presence, and I know you're a keynote speaker, and also you probably have practiced that a lot. I mean, I got to ask you, is that a practice thing that you do, your hand mannerisms, or are you just naturally animated like that?
That's a good question. So I will say, I am a professor, so I talk, right? I talk sort of regularly. And the wonderful thing about teaching is that you get instant feedback, in which there are a bunch of people like, I have no idea what she's talking about. Or you get people like nodding. And so I actually think that, I've been teaching for 26 years. I've gotten better at it. But I will also say I work with a wonderful speech coach, Susan Daniels. I'll give her a shout out. I know she follows me on Instagram. And Susan is wonderful. Yeah, she's a wonderful speech coach. And again, what I think is that my writing gets better because I have good editors. My speaking gets better because I got instant feedback from students and a great speaking coach. So I'm a firm believer in growth mindset and improvement and effort and trying.
Yeah, and you seem like a really naturally cheery person. I got to tell you that. I would never guess otherwise, especially with the dogs. I mean, like say for example, I mean, you got to wonder. I mean, is it uh do dogs essentially make people happy, or is it that happy people gravitate towards dogs? It's like the same thing with marriage. I mean, they say that marriage, uh, you know, people that are in long-lasting marriages tend to be happier. But at the same time, is it that marriage makes people happy, or is it that happy people are more apt to have successful marriages? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's actually something that I talk about with my students in my close relationship seminar, which I teach in the spring semester. And the research does suggest that happy people are more likely to get married. That is true. And happy people are also less likely to get divorced. So even after you get married, people who are happy are less likely to experience a divorce. But we also know, of course, that good marriage, not marriage in general, but good marriage also makes people happy. So it's probably sort of this, yes and, right? So cause and effect in that way.
So you're saying it's essentially both. I mean, it's essentially both. I mean,
Yeah, it's essentially both. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, I guess it can be. Why can't it be both? I mean,
Yeah.
that
Not
totally
either or.
makes a lot of
Not always
sense.
either or. Yeah. Yeah.
There was one really interesting thing that I seen the other day when I was doing some research, preparing notes, preparing questions here, that I saw in a Gallup poll that suggested something like 83 or 85% of people, when they were polled recently in 2023, said that they were actually content and happy with their life, but essentially, these days, there's a mental health crisis that's going on. So many people are struggling with their own mental health. There's an epidemic of loneliness that's taking place. And do you think, is it true? Do you think that Gallup poll is right, that 83% of people are actually content? Or do you think it's that we're just more likely, no matter how miserable we are, to say that we're happy when we're retrospectively?
Yeah, I will say that an 83% saying that they're content, that strikes me as a high number. I mean, my my reaction to that is I think the same as yours. So I wonder if part of it is, I wonder if content people are more likely to respond to a Gallup poll, right? I wonder if people who are less content are like, I'm not going to take that poll, or I'm not going to be helpful to this phone interviewer. And I wonder if people don't want to admit, yeah, I'm not very content with my life, and there's maybe some stigma about that or some self-blame.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I found that was so interesting, but I mean, because not that I was trying to conclusion shop or anything, but I mean, when I looked at it, it's like I
Yeah.
expected to see, 80% of people identify as unhappy, but no, it was actually quite the opposite, and it really shocked me. And it made me think, well, I mean, in some ways it makes sense. I mean, you take someone off the street that's kind of rather miserable, and if you're talking to a stranger, you ask them, are you content with your life? Most people, in retrospect, will look back and say, well, yeah, I'm content, even though in the moment they actually may not be. I mean, it's such a weird aspect of happiness. It's almost like somehow it splits, from when we start to look at ourselves retrospectively, compared to the way that we feel in the moment right now. I mean, I found that so odd.
Yeah, I agree with you. It does. It does seem like a very, very high number.
Well, I'll send that to you too, so you can have a
Yeah, I'd
look
love
at
to.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and also what you said too definitely makes sense. I mean, people that are content are probably more likely to respond to a Gallup poll, and people that have a level of discontent probably don't have anything to do with any kind of pollster. So I mean, that's something that I didn't consider
Right?
either.
Yeah. I mean, responding to a poll is being helpful, right? So responding to a poll is saying, I'm going to take some time out of my day to answer an email or answer the phone. And it could well be that people who are grumpy are like, no, I'm not going to do that. So I wonder if that's also, having some kind of an effect.
So, within our own personal relationships, we often find that, what brings us happiness conflicts with what brings someone else happiness, whether it's a coworker or whether it's your spouse, whether it's your kids, and it often leaves us at times struggling, with how do we proceed? How do we go on here? If my idea of happiness is to do this over the weekend, but your idea of happiness is to do this over the weekend, it feels like one of us is constantly having to lose out and sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of someone else's happiness. So how would you recommend that we proceed in life and in our social endeavors and fostering these relationships that you speak of, that we need to focus on building, if our happiness doesn't exactly jive with what someone else's happiness is?
Yeah, that's such an important question. So what the research would tell us is that the decision that you make actually isn't important. Whatever you do, whatever the choices you make, whatever the conclusion is, doesn't matter. What matters is how you reach that decision. And so when you're in a relationship with somebody, you make decisions all the time. What religious practices are we going to teach our kids? How do we prioritize spending money versus saving money? What do we want to do on Saturday night? Where do we want to go on vacation? How do we deal with the in-laws? Whatever it is, the reality is you face some kinds of conflicts, you face some kind of disagreements. What's important in terms of predicting happiness and relationship satisfaction and longevity is actually how do you manage and navigate those differences so that both people feel heard and understood and valued. And that process of working through conflict and disagreements is actually the single best predictor of divorce.
Wow. So you're saying essentially that it's, don't worry so much about the end result. Don't worry so much about what you want over the weekend, what you think is going to bring you happiness, because in the end, what's going to bring you happiness isn't so much the end result as much as it is going to be the path that you take to get there, whatever it may be.
Exactly. And that's really important, frankly, for couples to understand and recognize, right? That it's not what is the outcome, it's the process you use to get there.
Well, Dr. Sanderson, I thank you so much for taking your time here with us today. And you've been an awesome help to me and many others, undoubtedly. I'd like to give you a moment here to go ahead and tell the audience, where could we find you? Where do you want us to search for you? What kind of projects are you working on? And anyone that's looking to reach out to you for help, how should they find you?
Oh, well, so thanks for that opportunity. And I'm on social media on Instagram at Sanderson Speaking. And I have a website that's sandersonspeaking.com. And I talk about happiness and health and psychology and the nerdy academic life of a professor, and also lots about dogs. So anyone reach out to me on social media or my website if you want to learn more. Thanks so much.
Yes, please do check out Sanderson Speaking on Instagram. Her page is a wealth of knowledge to help you get along through your day. And definitely please check out the Mad Philosopher Profanity on Instagram too as well. I post psychological content every single day, profound quotes that can also help you get through your day, and as well as my own writing that I'm developing, and this podcast too as well. Subscribe to the podcast for great guests like Dr. Catherin Sanderson here. And thank you all so much for joining us. Dr. Sanderson, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you for the invitation to talk, and have a wonderful rest of your day.